I'm Steve Clemens. Sorry for the short delay. I also want to say hello to the folks Washington on the American Strategist blog and the Washington Note blog. It's good to be with everyone. This is a real pleasure. Pat Choate isn't someone who really needs an introduction. He ran for vice president of this country in the Reform Party in 1996 with Ross Perot. But he's had one of the coolest backgrounds of anyone that I've known in Washington, D.C., and he was, in fact, my first mentor and the provider of my first office. I always wondered if I told people that publicly whether it would help me or hurt me. Pat, and I do want to get a little personal for a minute. I used to run an organization in Los Angeles many years ago called the Japan-America Society of Southern California, and it was in the mid-1980s. And around this time was when those people who were raising questions about how does power work in the world we were tripping into. Is power work by how big your guns are, how you can roll tanks, or is power the weight of your currency, the weight of your manufacturing footprint, your ability to move economic issues? And at that time in the mid-1980s, the sort of Kissingerian interest crowd had a hard time dealing with Japan and what it meant. And there were a number of people, all of whom pretty much disagreed with one another, but they were basically saying Japan is different, Japan is important, Japan's economic footprint is translating into a kind of power that we weren't able to figure out. Pat Choate wrote a book at the time called Agents of Influence when he was working as TRW's chief lobbyist here in Washington. Now, he didn't continue to work for TRW after he wrote this book, but it was, in my mind, one of the more important books, and I hosted Pat to come in and talk at the Japan-American Society at LA. I think I was the only Japan-American Society at that point that had asked Pat to do that, or to have been, some might say, foolish enough to have done so, but I was proud to have done so. And it broke open our programming field to James Fallows, who's been the chairman of our board up until recently here at the New American Foundation, Clyde Prestowitz, Chalmers Johnson, many other marquee names who were the ones asking at the forefront of this period of time, and all of whom became good friends of mine during my 7 years when I was at Japan Society. So Pat came in and did this, and it's ironic that we're talking about this because as I look at the Georgia issue and Randy Schooneman's role acting as Georgia's paid lobbyist here on its NATO membership, also getting paid at the same time by the John McCain campaign, I really do think that in your next book, Pat, you ought to go back and do Agents of Influence, 2.0. I've got some stories for you. And look at this question of lobbying. But Pat Choate was really one of the most influential, most important lobbyists and then commenters on American power in this scene. And I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but it was a really fun time hanging out in Pat Choate's office, because one day this short little guy with big ears came in, Ross Perot. Pat wasn't there, and we hung out for a couple of hours, during the day. The next week, Pat Buchanan, a bigger guy with big ears, came in and hung out. And then another time I was in the office, and Richard Gephardt came over, walked across the street to Pat's small office at Second and Mass, and I said, now let's get this right. You got Ross Perot, who's sort of the independent, Pat Buchanan that time, who was sort of a leading Republican, and at that time, had a real chance at winning the Republican nomination. And then you had Dick Gephardt, of course, and Pat made this line, and he says, it's not necessarily which horse you ride, it's capturing a franchise, which is a classic Pat Choate line. But beyond all the personal, so I'm a huge admirer of Pat Choate. He was and remains a major mentor of mine in both politics and policy, and he has written an important new book, Dangerous Business, The Risks of Globalization for America. We have a lot, and we hear a lot about the positive dimensions of globalization from many folks, and not a lot of people have stepped back and sort of asked the question of, in a more systematic way, what is some of the downside? What's happening? How do we think about it? How do we frame it? And how do we take it out of an ideological debate and battle and get into some of the micro-realities of globalization, what works? Pat has been at this for a long time. I just pulled off my bookshelf a few moments ago a Council on Foreign Relations paper titled Democratizing U.S. Trade Policy, which was done some years ago with Bruce Stokes and Pat Choate as the principal provocateurs of this, but included Sandy Levin, Amo Houghton, and other members of the Congress. I happen to be one of the study group, but this is one of the best, continuing best pieces of work looking at how to connect trade and global trends and get those benefits from there reconnected to working class Americans and to a national economic strategy that makes some sense. And this was 10 years ago, and I'm telling everybody, 10 years ago when Bill Clinton was saying that we didn't need to worry, we're making big jobs, we're living off the IT bubble, and we were able to ignore all these things. 10 years ago there was some very rich and important work done, and I'm excavating that work and trying to give it a sort of 2008 spin. But Pat Choate has the book. I am very much looking forward to welcoming him here, and we will have a great discussion afterward. Please welcome Pat Choate.
Thanks. That's great. That's a very generous introduction, and I appreciate it, and I take a great reflective pride in seeing what Steve has done and seeing this particular organization. I'm proud that this is the third book that they've been kind enough to introduce. I have one personal story. It's quick. After Agents of Influence was out and a couple of other books came out, there was a movie made called The Rising Sun. And Steve was an advisor there, and one of the things that he did is there was a bit part that involved Eleanor Cliff playing herself, me playing myself, Clarence Page, and Michael Kinsley. They had us all in to act to do a show, and they had some very simple script for us to read. And the four of us just simply couldn't get it. The one thing that I think all four of us learned, we better keep our day jobs, which we did. I'd like to acknowledge right from the beginning, this book is dedicated to George Becker, the steelworkers, former head of the steelworkers. He is the person that suggested and inspired me to write this particular book. I had signed up to write a book about FDR and World War II, which I put off, and he said, no, we're at a critical point. You need to do this. The steelworkers have been enormously supportive, Leo Gerard and all of their people, although all the views in this book are my own. And the issue is finally, I think, coming to the examination that it should have had 15 years ago. I think the issue is not whether we will be in globalization or whether our economy will be more deeply entwined with other countries, for it will. The question is how we do it, what policies do we adopt, who will set those policies, and who will benefit from those policies. To the present, the way that we have operated has been one in which we simply have thrown open our markets, guaranteed investment abroad, and been willing to allow the consequences to unfold. We've put into place no safeguards on globalization. This is one of the reasons that we have a situation where we have these massive imports of foods and medicines and other goods that are unsafe. At the same time that we've had this surge of inflow, what we have done is we have actually cut the inspection funds that we give to the Food and Drug Administration. The pet food scandal, the tomatoes, are only the very tiny tip of a large amount of goods that are coming into our market that are unsafe. The FDA, which inspects 80% of the food and drugs that come in to this country, has the responsibility, is able to inspect less than 1% of those items. Put that into context, in 1999 it was inspecting 4%, Japan inspects 15% that comes in to their market. What we have, moreover, is even with that 1%, is a massive amount of defective substandard goods are caught. China last year had something like 1,900 shipments that were caught and turned back. India had 1,700. Mexico had 1,500. And the thing to remember is twofold. One, that was less than 1% being inspected. And two, we have a peculiar policy. If a good is found to be defective or if the food is contaminated, we allow the shipper to take it back. And what the FDA reports is the shipper often will just simply go from Seattle to San Francisco or Boston to New York. The odds are 99 to 1 that the good will get into the United States. A second aspect of the security dimensions of this is that we are outsourcing increasingly our defense industrial base. The United States could not fight a prolonged war because we have lost the industrial capacity to do it. The Ammunition Surge Roundtable reports of the 301 critical items that are necessary to produce ammunition, a very basic item. 30 of those, 30 out of the 100, we only have a foreign source. 71 out of the 300, we're down to one source. And when we got into the war in Iraq, we found ourselves in a situation by 2004 we were running out of ammunition for our troops and had to do emergency contracts in England and in Israel. This is not unique. Moreover, the Department of Defense, according to the General Accountability Office, reports that they do not keep accurate records below a third tier of suppliers. So we find ourselves in a situation with our critical weapons that we're, one, outsourcing, and two, we do not have accurate records of where we're outsourcing. That's important. I think, and having done studies for the U.S.-China Commission, that a major portion of that outsourcing is coming from what I call the China sphere. It's China and the 10 major countries that surround China. When you look at advanced technology trade and the work of Dr. Charles McMillan and others, what you see is the United States has shifted from being the world's largest producer of advanced technology products to the world's largest importer of advanced technology products. Large numbers of those are dual technology goods that we use in our weapon systems. That's the second part of the security dimensions that we have. I will have a third part of the security dimensions. We have, with the end of the Cold War, still maintained export controls on certain vital technologies. That's done out of the Commerce Department, it's done out of the State Department, it's done out of the Defense Department. And these are technologies that we deem critical to the national security. At the same time, in 1999, as part of globalization and harmonizing our patent system with that of other countries, we agreed that at 18 months after an inventor files an application, that application in its entirety would be put up on the internet. A patent application has a requirement called the best mode, in which the inventor must tell everything they know about the best way to produce something. Now, this has become a very dangerous thing in globalization. Commercially, what we find, to be more specific, that the Japanese Patent Office finds, is that the South Koreans are doing about 55,000 hits a day on the Japanese computer systems to look at patent applications. The Chinese are doing roughly 17,000 hits a day on the Japanese computer system. We know the same thing is happening upon the computer system of the USPTO. For many industries, many countries, their R&D program consists of putting groups of engineers in rooms with high-speed internet connections and then taking a look at the patent applications in other countries. That becomes particularly pernicious since it now takes 32 months on average to get a patent in the United States. But even more dangerous is what we find is that there's a lack of coordination between the U.S. Patent Office and Department of Commerce, State, and Defense. So many of these technologies that are restricted, and restricted I mean you can't ship it outside the country, you cannot talk to a foreign citizen, you cannot share information. Those same technologies that are restricted, the patents on them are being put up on the internet. It's an open back door. It's a major security breach, and it continues even as we speak. And I can give you examples of that. A second major consequence of globalization is the issue of sovereignty. By joining the World Trade Organization, the United States agreed that we would allow any member state to challenge any law of the federal, state, or local government as being trade inhibiting. And it has happened dozens of times. And as it happens, what we find is the United States, when we lose a case, and we lose 9 out of 10 cases, is that we're required to either pay compensation to other countries or we're required to change our own laws. That is important because it not only affects laws that are made, it affects laws that are being made, as the question is asked, is this WTO compatible or not? We agreed that we would not deal directly with other countries. If there is a violation of the WTO agreement, we would take this through a trade dispute mechanism. And moreover, we accepted a very anti-democratic procedure in those WTO proceedings. The media is not permitted to attend those proceedings. Those who are not involved are not permitted to see the papers that are filed. The rulings themselves and the rationale is not shared, and the WTO does the vetting of those who sit in as judges. We do not do the vetting. It is a very secretive process. As part of that, there are provisions in the World Trade Agreement that are devastating to our economy. One provision is how direct and indirect taxes are considered. Most of the world uses an indirect tax, the value-added tax. Under the value-added tax, a country that uses that can rebate that tax on all exports, and they can charge an equivalent tax on all imports that come in to that country. Germany, for example, has a 19% value-added tax. When Mercedes-Benz ships a car to the United States, Mercedes-Benz gets a 19% rebate on the price of that car. That is a massive subsidy by any measure. When General Motors sends a Cadillac into Germany, then General Motors must pay a 19% VAT equivalent, and they must pay a VAT equivalent on the transport and insurance, which really makes it about a 20%. That is a massive tariff. And indeed, what we have seen when you take a look in Europe, as the tariffs have gone down, the VAT has gone up. The value of the tariffs in Europe today are very small. The VAT is very high. You add the two together as a trade impediment, they're the same now as they were in the 1950s. We've negotiated tariffs down and the VAT has gone up. The cost on this to the U.S. has gone from about $150 billion in 1995 to last year it was about $357 billion. Offsetting a $357 billion VAT disadvantage is beyond the technological and productivity capacities of most companies, and it is a driving force for many companies in the United States to move their production offshore. And then the final question, the final major effect, is that of prosperity. The trade agreements that we have entered do directly affect the prosperity of the United States. Sir James Goldsmith, in a very prescient little book called The Trap that he published in 1993, made the argument that the way that we were doing globalization was such that we created a dynamic where if companies stayed in the United States or stayed in the West with our social networks, with our concern for workers, with our concern for the environment, if they stayed here and competed against companies that moved and could bring their goods in tariff-free, then those who stayed would go bankrupt, and those who left would become very rich. That was the trap. In one move, what we did with NAFTA and the WTO and these agreements, we cracked a social compact that had been forged over a century through negotiations, through strikes, through legislation, through politics, and a variety of means. And thus we see, as these companies have shifted production, workers left without their pensions, they're left without their health care, we don't have the retraining, we don't have the relocation, we don't have the counseling, we don't have all of the things that should have been put into place. 1/3 of this book deals with those issues. The second third of the book gets into why it happens. In part, I argue, and I won't go into the details, but part of it is the rise of a new mercantilism in Asia. And this new mercantilism is very powerful. In China, it is guided by techno specialists who are very good. I have ultimate respect for the Chinese leaders' technical abilities. The 9 members of the Politburo are all engineers. All came up from the bottom. All made it on merit. All are development specialists. You dissect the development inside China, and what you see is an engineering mind at work, laying it out systematically. There's been a series of studies done by Professor Navarro from the University of California looking at the factors of the China price differential, and what you find is that the labor costs are about 37 out of 100 points. But you also have other factors that are involved, which I identify in the book, that talk about things such as the disregard for the environment, the clustering of industries, much as Henry Ford did with River Rouge, where he brought everything together, tax incentives that exist. Intel, for example, is building a major fab facility inside China. About half of the facility's cost is being subsidized by the Chinese government. And China has on the books a law that says that a company can take 150% tax credit if they will continue to expand their R&D activities by 10% a year. So you build a facility, you're doing R&D, and the Chinese scientists and engineers are very good indeed. And if you just keep moving your work from the West to China, so you get that 10%, you have massive financial incentives. So mercantilism is one thing. Second thing is we have an elite that is increasingly disconnected from the American people. And the third thing is we have a political system of corporatism in which financial interests, corporate interests, have come to dominate our government. Quite literally, we have a situation in which we finance our campaigns in such a way that, as Fritz Holling says, for him to have run again, he would have had to have raised $35,000 a day for 6 years. That's an enormous amount of money. It puts our political leaders under enormous obligations. And then on top of that, we have political ideology at work of that government is not the solution, government is the problem, coming from President Reagan, and the no new tax ideology. We have, as of today, 43 senators and 190 members of the House of Representatives who have signed a formal no tax pledge, and that includes adjusting things such as the highway fund for inflation. And inflation adjustment is considered a tax increase. This has put our government into a real gridlock. We find it very difficult to do the things that we need to do with an expanding population and to deal with a world that is increasingly competitive, where we do need to invest money in R&D and research and infrastructure. What do we do about it? The last third of this book is solutions, things that can be done, things that are within our power, things that mostly, not all, but mostly will be done within the context of our other international agreements. The first thing that I recommend is that we deal with the problem of ethics within our government. One of the major problems that we have is that we have a large number of people who now come to Washington to work to develop a lobbying career. I identify in the back of this book, I mean, I will not be getting many Christmas cards this year. I identify in the back of this book 500 people who since 1993 have held very high positions in government at the executive level 1 and 2 levels, who have left office and have become registered lobbyists, many for foreign governments and many for foreign corporations. Secondly, I've identified the members of Congress that have taken that path. Since 1998, half of all the members of Congress who have left office have registered and become lobbyists. You cannot put together a program for the country long term if you have revolving door appointments. You cannot staff a government with people who want to become lobbyists and deal with the tough problems, with the tough decisions that we have ahead of us. What I suggest is doing something actually that Bill Clinton did in 1993. Bill Clinton in 1993 put into effect a federal ethics contract through an executive order. On the day it was inaugurated, he put an executive order that anyone who was on a transition team, anyone who was going to hold one of those 6,000 presidential appointments, must sign a contract that for 5 years they would not, after they left office, they would not go back and lobby the agency they worked for. They would not become a registered foreign agent under the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938. And if they were a trade negotiator, they would do nothing, either in the executive branch or the Congress, to assist or advise any foreign interest on the question of trade agreements. That stayed in place 8 years. On Bill Clinton's last day in office, he wrote another executive order canceling the first executive order, freeing all of his people. But be that as it may, the executive order that he wrote, and I quote it in the book, is one of the finest ethics things that has been done. I think it's legitimate for the American people to say of their president, or the candidates for president, will you, on your inauguration day, Senator Obama or Senator McCain, reinstitute that order? And will you, in your 100-day agenda, embed it into law so we deal with it? I also think that we need to do things with much more transparency. I think all cabinet officers, all people that are engaged in that sort of activity should file financial reports, as senators do, for 5 years after they're in office. I think ex-presidents should sign and provide such disclosure for a lifetime. I'm very disturbed by seeing Bill Clinton make $50 million in speeches in China, in Asia, and other places. It has the appearance of delayed payment for services rendered. A second thing is we need to use the opportunity created by the collapse of the Doha round of negotiations to say, for the next president to say, that we have a rather clean slate, that the failure of 7 years of negotiations is representative of the fact that the global trade system is not working, and that we wish to renegotiate, and that we have some minimal standards that we want. First, with the WTO, we should say that we wanted proportional voting. Now in that 152-member body, the U.S. has 1 vote, Antigua has 1 vote. Those votes have equal weight. If we have 22% of the global economy, we should have 22% of the votes. We should, as with congressional redistricting, every some period, 5 years, 10 years, reallocate. If 10 years from now we have 30%, we should have 30% of the votes. If we have 18%, we should have 18% of the vote. Secondly, the operations of the WTO should be made transparent. Quite literally, if democratically enacted laws are going to be overturned, at a minimum, what we should require is that that process be open so that we can see it. Third thing, I would say that any action of the WTO that affects the U.S. that will require a change of our laws should be run through Congress with a vote. This will highlight what is happening. The fourth thing There should be no negotiations unless we deal with this discrimination created by the VAT tax. This is costing us too much. We have tried in 3 different negotiations, in the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, and the Doha round, to have that done. That has not been done. Identify a series of other things that we need to do domestically. We need a national capital budget. Our infrastructure is falling apart inside this country. It offers the means to create millions of new jobs, to underpin a dynamic economy. We have deliberately not had a capital budget, which every corporation and every state government has, because going back to the 1960s, when we restructured the budgets, President Johnson did not want a capital budget because he thought it would compete with the social programs of the great societies. There's an interesting history on that. Now what we need is to identify long-term what our infrastructure needs are, and there'll be something in the range of $2 trillion. We need to identify how we're going to do it, and we also need to identify how we're going to finance that and how we're going to maintain that infrastructure. The greatest generation, one of their legacies was to build us the interstate highway system. One of this generation's legacies must be to keep it, to maintain it, to repair it, and prepare for the next 50 years of Americans, their infrastructure. There's a couple of dozen of other recommendations in the book like these. All of these are possible. All of these are within our power. I know that many people think that America has suffered financial and economic blows that are irreparable. I fully disagree. It is totally within our power as a people to reverse these trends and get our economy moving again. Why don't I stop there and open it up for some questions?
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you.
You.
Let me open up for questions, but let me come back to this question of your recommendations, which I've had my very good staff come in and they ordered them differently. But restructuring the WTO in this sort of moment of fallibility, I suppose, recognition, even by people like Larry Summers and Alan Blinder and others, that the distribution that many had hoped for from globalization's benefits was not working out as we hoped, so folks may not have the answers, but it's the question of what to do there. Secondly, as I understand it, you looked at a national worker adjustment system, and this may be what I'm, Max Baucus is very into trade adjustment assistance. My former colleague, Greg Mastel, is as well. And I've always felt like this was a sad fig leaf to pass trade deals, that you could be for TAA, but having worked for Jeff Bingaman in New Mexico and watched Levi's plants move out of Roswell, and I have to try to prove to a certification officer that trade impacted these jobs, it was kind of a baloney process. Very few benefits came in that were anything real. But it did raise the question of a turbulent economy that was constantly tearing itself apart and putting itself back together. How do you help workers deal with the realities of a turbocharged economy? And so maybe we didn't need a TAA, but we needed a labor adjustment assistance that was far more systemic. And I'm interested in if that's where you're going there. And I just say on the capital budget thing, for those people who are watching on the net and who are interested, the New America Foundation has a huge project on infrastructure. In fact, it's our big idea. What is it, newamerica.net, Big Ideas? Cheryl Schweninger has helped launch this month a major piece of art. Has gotten a lot of congressional attention, a lot of media attention, because we're completely with you on infrastructure. But I am interested in whether this labor adjustment package needs to be something like capital infrastructure. It's going to be a big cost, but what a great benefit that would be to an economy that stopped trying to hide this as a trade-related issue, but rather a function of sort of a larger macro reality of how the American economy is organized.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I wrote a book on this called The High Flex Society, and I think it's still pertinent. Basically, what we've got to recognize is most of our workers are going to require retraining or booster shots of training 7 or 8 times during their life. It's going to be all of us in doing it. So the question is not just simply for the trade, but how do we set up a system where it happens on a regular basis? Well, it's a responsibility, I think, that needs to be divided, first of all, between the individual and society, and then in society between business and government, and then inside the division inside government. One of the things that I've proposed in the past is that we set up something called individual training accounts, is that workers and their employers put aside a certain amount of money that goes into a fund that would be used at the discretion of the worker for various types of training and for relocation. It's not just simply the training. In many cases, people have to move from one part of the country to the other. We need a portable personal pension system. We need a pension system that's tied to the worker and not to the job, and to allow somebody to build up a retirement account throughout their year and have the flexibility to move in and out of the workforce and between jobs, between industries, etc. Now, most of the training for adults will be done by employers on the job training. Most employers are reluctant to do that because they fear if they train someone, then that person will be hired away and that their money will be lost. So one of the things that we really need to do is to find a way to give tax credits to firms that engage in training. We need to go back and take a look at our community college system, our vocational technical systems, and we built a really great system in the 1970s, 80s, and the early part of the 1990s, and once again connect those systems to employers. The best model in this is the state of South Carolina, and it was created by then Governor Ernest Hollings, Fritz Hollings. And in South Carolina, they have facilities, but the facility is more of an intellectual concept. They will go to employers and say, what kind of a training do you need? And then they'll use company equipment in many cases, or they'll use company employees in many cases. They move past this whole idea that you need a state certification to teach, et cetera. What does the company need? It's demand-driven training, and if that demand changes in 2 years, you do it again. And by doing that sort of stuff, you give flexibility, you give choice, you let each level of government provide its role, and you appropriately divide the responsibilities.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Let me open the floor. Yes, in the very back. Xia?
Yeah, first, thank you for your coming to the New American Foundation.
Thank you.
I'm Cha Chen, freelance correspondent. I have two questions. When we talk about the trade deficit, we never mention about the service trade. I have been told that actually American service have a surplus to any country. And do you know this service trade surplus is more than the so-called traditional trade deficit? And second is this, all the outsourcing industry to China by the US, Japan, EU, actually they are import the pollution, degradation, and occupational disease and global warming. What to do about this? Thank you.
Okay, as to the first question of the service trades, yes, the United States does a great deal in service trade, but the service surplus is a fraction, I think, something like 1/8 of the manufacturing deficit that we have and going down. When you take a look, moreover, Dr. Charles McMillan issued a very interesting report a couple of days ago, and where he tracked out what has happened in this last month. It turns out that the goods deficit increased by about 4.1%, and the service surplus went up about 86%. But the service surplus going up was primarily based upon the United States becoming a cheap place to come, and it becoming very expensive for Americans to go abroad. I think when you dissect the service trades, when you dissect the manufacturing deficits, the service surplus, the serviceability will never beat that. And moreover, what we find is that much of the service surplus has been because of royalties that have paid on intellectual property. Increasingly, what we find is that R&D activities are going abroad following manufacturing, and so even that part of the service trade will not be a solution. There is no substitute for bringing back American manufacturing jobs.
I mean, Pat, just before I take another question, the other day I read a quote by John Engler, former Michigan governor and president of the National Association of Manufacturers, and the quote made me a little crazy. And what it said was that within just a few years now, China will emerge as the largest manufacturing platform in the world. And John's reaction was, well, that's not that surprising. Of course, this is great for China. China's coming along the way. And I'm not an anti-China type, but I'm sort of saying, and his final comment was, this could be good for those companies that export and but there was no recognition at all that this is somewhat of a seismic shift, nor was there the reflection of concern about the basic health of the American manufacturing sector. Now, I know NAM does institutionally worry about the health of the manufacturing sector, but it just seems to me that there's been a forfeiture of worry, of concern about the erosion of manufacturing here. And I'm wondering, in your own engagement with senators, I know you're going to be speaking up in the Congress soon, and I know your interactions with Congress over a long time, there's always a lot of interest, but who's willing to say, who's willing to actually do something to sort of talk about what it does take to get a manufacturing strategy back?
Well, I think it's really going to be incumbent, given this timid political environment that we have, I think it's going to be incumbent on groups like this and people such as in this room to effectively make the case that you cannot be a superpower without manufacturing, that you must produce goods and things, that it is not celestial mechanics that guarantees that China will always dominate on the manufacturing. Much of what is happening with China is a very smart development strategy coupled with some corporations that have no identification with the country and are simply maximizing their own profits. Now, in the long term, I think they're very foolish on this. The Chinese will not need them in 20 years, 10 years. And moreover, you take a look at the Chinese development plans, they talk about their state champions, the 50 state champions that they're identifying, that they want to be of major size, the size of Intel, the size of Motorola. I find it almost schizophrenic that the Department of Defense in its strategic assessments every year identifies China as the major strategic threat, and at the same time we stand indifferent to seeing a major part of our manufacturing base go to China, our dependents go to China. And I think one of the major issues that the next president in Congress is going to face is that with the rise of the sovereign wealth funds in China, which are going to be enormous, I mean, there are various estimates have given that they're 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 4 trillion. The one thing that is clear, the sovereign investment funds are increasing $400 or $500 billion a year. Today, China has enough to buy 51% effective control of 25% of the companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, as a strategy, if I were advising the Chinese, and if we were advising the Chinese, we'd say, take an industry where you have concentration, 3 or 4 firms, pick the weakest firm there, buy that firm, bolster it, and you're instantly a global champion. The Chinese are going to do that. They're putting into place the infrastructure with their relationships with Goldman Sachs and Royal Bank of Scotland and Bank of America.
And it's a smart strategy.
It's a very, I have great admiration for the Chinese and their development. They're very good developers.
Let me open up questions. Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Manufacturing. I think manufacturing jobs in this country are not good jobs because they were manufacturing. They were good jobs because they were unionized jobs. Until the CIO, our manufacturing looked like Chinese manufacturing today, and the workers weren't benefiting, they were being exploited. So I think the question is more about reviving the unions in some form and making sure that union or non-union, people are getting paid decent wages. What all this offshoring has done is it has moved money from workers to the corporations. And the corporations are the ones who run our trade negotiations. We didn't end up with this WTO in spite of our negotiators. We ended up with it because of our negotiators.
So unions.
I fully agree. When I was talking about breaking a century of social relationships, the union relationships, the globalization, the way we've done globalization did that. There's absolutely no need for that. The union movement inside this country had both a monopoly face and a social face. And most of the social improvements that we have that came out of the New Deal and it came out subsequently is because of the unions. And moreover, as the unions have weakened, we're seeing those social institutions weaken. I'm very encouraged, though. I think large numbers of Americans have come to understand that what is good for Goldman Sachs is not necessarily good for America and for American workers. And I'm also greatly encouraged to see a new generation of union leaders, very smart, very sophisticated, that are speaking and talking and doing the right kinds of things and making the right kinds of demands. I was on the Lou Dobbs show last night, and my point, the big point that I was trying to make is the next couple of years are going to be very much like 1933 and 1944. We're in one of those great change periods inside this country. And when you look at the numbers, what you find is that something like 77% of the American people are very dissatisfied with President Bush's economic policies. 34% of the people say jobs and the economy is the #1 issue. 14% on Iraq, 14% on gasoline prices. It's more than 2 to 1 in jobs and economy. I mean, my view is the candidate that can connect with the American people, and neither one has so far, on the jobs and economy issue, and actually has something to say, even though it may be controversial, is going to be our next president.
Do you think unions have reformed enough? Because when I worked with Jeff Bingaman in the 90s, and of course we were working together at that time too, my sense is, with all due respect to the unions, and I don't mean this in every case, is that they were as frozen in place, that if you read High Flex Society, which I read, and you read any other Pat Choate work out there, the position and posture of the unions was inconsistent with sort of Pat Choate's prescription of what a healthy economy would look like at that time. And the question is, have unions become less of a stopper, if you will, or been able to modify both representing labor rights, environmental rights, and these other important concerns, but also getting ahead of how to look at how to win. Now, people, mutual friends of ours like Mike Wessel and others are there already. But I'm not convinced, or I haven't been convinced, that the union structures are part of the solution.
I would agree with you. In the 1990s, one of the great disappointments was to see the FFL-CIO not make a full-bore push on NAFTA. They went with the president, but rather than on the deal. It wasn't a full-bore attack against the deal. But I think that caused such a stress inside the union movement that you've seen the emergence of these new leaders, these new people. You take Leo Gerard, the steel workers, a friend. And you see the steel workers now head of the policy committee. These are the kinds of issues that are being talked and being pushed. I think that what we now have is a big, solid base, an independent, solid base that is willing to push on these kinds of issues.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, Jock Nash.
They, in today's Financial Times, they had an article about whether, no, it basically said that America's decline won't be that easy to reverse, and they went into a lot of good reasons why we're in this decline. But you know, we've been consuming more than we're producing, and we've been spending more than we're earning, and in some cases we've been doing that for 30 years, building up trillions of dollars of debt. Mm-hmm. Some people suggest that it will take us as long to get out of this problem as it took us to get in. I was wondering if you have any indication, any clue, any evidence that America is still the type of the country that's willing to sacrifice now for a future reward. I see no indication today that we're willing to sacrifice to make sure that our children are left debt-free, that our infrastructure is in good shape, that so on and so forth. We seem to be not concerned at all with the next generation.
Well,
and all the countries that do care about the next generation, like China and others, are doing very, very well.
you know, I think for policy-wise, presidents are remembered basically for one or two things. I think Bill Clinton is going to be remembered for imposing a tax increase when every Republican voted against it in 1992. It led to a surge in the economy, and we were actually paying down the budget deficit. It shows it can be done. What we're seeing now are a set of policies that are driven ideologically. The Bush administration has had three big domestic objectives. One is to privatize Social Security. Second, to shift as much of the federal government's work to the private sector as it could, and it's done a massive amount of that. And the third is to convert the highway system basically to a toll road system, and I write about that in here. You change administrations and you say that we want to go back to a road system, for example, that provides the best transportation for the least cost rather than a road system that is the most profitable for the owners. You get into the question of having a fiscal policy that says we'll do what's best for the country rather than binding ourselves to a no new tax pledge. And we can easily work ourselves out into $350 billion VAT disadvantage against our country through trade negotiations. Rebuild our infrastructure. We're a very rich country. I mean, we have problems, no question. Put in Glass-Steagall again. Regulate Wall Street and the banks, who have turned out to be kleptomaniacs in stealing on a massive basis. Do these sound logical things that a prudent...
Any thoughts on Bob Rubin?
Well, I
thought I'd make a little news.
Well, I do, but I'm very disappointed by the people that the two candidates are surrounded to advise themselves. John McCain has got Phil Gramm with him. Phil Gramm is the worst economist of the last part.
Well,
of
he's
the
lurking in the shadows now.
Well, I mean, think about it. It was Graham Rudman on taxes, which helped bring us the deficit. This is the guy that championed getting rid of Glass-Steagall, which brought us the financial activities. And he thinks Americans that are feeling pain are whiners. Not the guy I want as treasurer. You go with Obama, he's got the same team that brought us NAFTA and the WTO. I hope that both candidates are playing to the establishment. I don't think that we can know from the way you run our political campaigns what they'll really be. Franklin Roosevelt ran on the program of balancing the budget.
Really?
Yeah, he did. He did.
That's interesting.
You know, the point that I make is we only find out about presidents once they're in office. To be a great president, and I hope that anyone who wants to be president wants to be a great president, you need a great crisis. We have a great crisis here. The potential there is for the next president to be great. And, you know, let's hope that they do.
Got time for just a couple of questions. Let me go to Warren, and we'll go here real quick. Warren? There's a microphone right here.
Could you elaborate on why it is you think that the operation of the VAT and the repayment of it at the border is a subsidy? American manufacturers, automobile manufacturers, don't pay a VAT, and imported ones, as you pointed out, don't pay it either because it's refunded, so they seem to be on even footing. We have a sales tax, which both the imported and domestically produced car pay. So it seems a very level playing field to me.
It is, in both cases, when Mercedes-Benz is in the U.S., they're paying a direct tax, a corporation. That's the same as with the domestic. The same is true on the sales tax. But the differential becomes when they produce it inside Germany and send it to the United States, they get that 19% back. I think when one takes a look at that, that could only be considered a tax subsidy. They're sending us a tax-free good. We're sending them a good that bears the corporate tax. They do not give credit for the direct tax. They don't offset that. And indeed, they add the 19%.
So I see what you're saying is that in Germany, for a product created there, they are not reflecting in their manufacturing, cost of manufacturing, the tax. It's being removed. In the U.S. case, if you manufacture the car here, your tax basis is built in.
That's right.
Right, okay.
Think of the payroll tax.
Yeah.
A perfect example is they're rebating their health care and social service costs. I'm Lloyd Wood with Amtech. Yeah. And you know, our producer here, we're paying payroll tax. I mean, all of us. I mean, every hour we work up to the first $97,000, we're being taxed on our labor on what we produce. And you know, with the countries with a VAT tax, when you export, what you're saying is essentially we're going to rebate part of that cost. And so we're paying on both ends. We're paying our costs when we produce here, and then when we ship abroad, we're not only paying our costs, but we're paying part of Germany's costs or China's costs.
You know, I'm sure this is out there, but it would be very interesting. You know, Dave McCurdy, who's president of the Automobile Manufacturers Association, was here the other day when we were talking about health care and how the high cost of health care in the United States is a competitive issue in terms of global competitiveness. But looked at the health care costs, I think in Europe in a car were about $150. In a Japanese automobile, it's about $450. I may have this wrong.
About $1,800.
And then about $1,800 in the U.S. And it'd be interesting to look at the price of a car, and I'm sure somebody's done this, and to sort of show if that VAT issue is real, you know, that it represents so much, but then also other breakdowns in terms of a comparative basis. So if any of you in the auto sector are watching, feel free to send me a cartoon or something with that right down. But yes, ma'am, let me go with you. Yeah, I'll keep mine in case I have to cut you off.
Excellent. I wonder if you would expand on your call for rebuilding infrastructure. I am hugely sympathetic with the whole concept, but as I'm sure you know...
Do you have our paper?
Not...
Get her our paper.
Yeah, I'll
there,
read the paper.
You got it right
but
there?
As I'm sure you
bring
know,
me a copy.
Infrastructure is a huge, wide thing. What would you do first, and how would you decide? Would you rebuild the highways? Would you look forward and start looking at things like broadband, internet access? What are you talking about for infrastructure, and how would you
Before he answers, here's an economic recovery program for the post-bubble economy. Excellent. On infrastructure. There you go.
And this is a great jobs creator, by the way, the infrastructure.
We think so, too.
I mean, are you just looking at, you know, guys to rebuild highways?
No.
It's like $1 billion of infrastructure expenditures, 47,000 jobs.
A lot. I can show you where it breaks down by, you know, materials, steel, you know.
I'm curious where you focus it.
Well, in my view, is I'd begin with a national capital budget, and it would be on domestic civil works, not defense infrastructure. So that's roads, bridges, water, wastewater, I'd go broadband, et cetera. Then the second thing is an identification of where we want to be in 5 years, 7 years, and then you back it up to how you do the financing. Now, on the highways,
would you keep PAYGO?
Here's how I'd do that. Let me tell you how I'd do that.
That's it. That's the key question.
Okay. Yeah. Here's how I'd do that. On highways, basically, I'd begin by quickly adjusting the gas tax for inflation. The gas tax is 18.4 cents. It hadn't been bumped since 1993. You bring it up to today's purchasing power, it'd be 9 cents. Then I would go with a plan that a senator named Prescott Bush introduced in 1956.
Cool.
Prescott Bush worked with Dwight Eisenhower to devise the financing of the interstate system. He and Senator Pay-As-You-Go Harry Byrd of Virginia. And Prescott Bush's idea was that you take the money and you capitalize it. So if you have 9 cents additional coming in through adjustment, that will produce $15 billion a year over a 4-year period of time. You got $60 billion. And very conservatively, you can capitalize that at 7 to 1. You've got $450 billion that you can have immediately to begin working. You take the 9 cents money in a sinking fund, it pays that off on it. Or if you wanted to be a bit more aggressive, you could take part of the 18.4 cents. Let's say you took 10 cents of that. That would be somewhere in the neighborhood of whatever that works out to 20+ billion per year. You capitalize that at, make it a conservative ratio of 7 or 8 to 1, and there's your $460 billion next year to rebuild the highways.
Is this plan consistent with, Pat, sorry to interrupt, but consistent with, or would it work at odds with Hagel and Dodd's idea, Senator Hagel and Senator Dodd of a national infrastructure bank? Could you?
I would have this as a separate thing.
Okay.
I would have this as a separate thing. The infrastructure bank would really be an adjunct to what the states of Indiana and Texas are doing as they move to tolling. Now, the Department of Transportation wants to do away with the gas tax. Mary Peters has testified to that. The second thing they want to do is these public-private partnerships. These public-private partnerships are, in effect, turn the operation over to private firms that will either take an existing road or build a new road, brownfield, greenfield, et cetera. When you break that down, just on the differential between operating as a private company, as is being done in Texas and is being done in Indiana, versus setting up a public authority, the differential is 30% just on the cost of capital. The
30% worse in the privatization?
No, the privatization costs 30% more.
Oh, that's what I meant.
You
Yeah.
wound up in Texas in, and I tell the story on here about the Texas and Indiana systems. In a 23-mile road in Dallas, Texas, the governor wanted to turn it over to a combine from Spain and from Australia. They put a bid in. It turns out there had been the Dallas-Fort Worth Turnpike, and Dallas has a history of a public authority operating. The people in the public authority were greatly outraged, and they demanded to bid, and they got the right to bid, and they brought it in for 30% less just on the cost of capital. So these public-private partnerships are really an attempt to turn ownership of the interstates and in certain roads inside the major urban areas to private companies. About 20% of the roads on the interstate will fit that model, but that leaves the other 80% across Iowa or New Mexico and Kansas, et cetera, how they're going to be found. My preference is to go back and say we want a free road system. The model we want is not the one that produces the most profit, the one that gives the best transportation at the lowest cost, that we actually go into those states where they've been sold and we buy them back and put them into a public system. One of the failures when the interstate was being built was 2,200 miles of road were brought in, Pennsylvania Turnpike, Indiana Turnpike. Prescott Bush tried to persuade the Congress to go and reimburse and buy those roads and put them under the same constraints as the rest. We didn't do it. We should do that at this point. And
Interesting.
the money is available.
Let me go last question right here. I'm sorry I can't get to everybody, but yes.
Yeah, you've
I'll give you-
you've
you're
talked
media,
quite a
so I'll
lot
give you-
about highways,
Yeah.
and
I'm sorry.
so you've talked quite a lot about highways, and not at all about energy.
Good
how many
question.
highways are we going to need?
Energy.
Well, I think there's several things that need to be done on energy. I think that we should have the forms of energy competing with each other. We should not allow the oil companies, for example, to be in every form of energy, to control coal, to control wind, control other. We need an antitrust policy. That's the first thing that we need. Second thing that we need is we need to take a very close look at our patent policy. What we have is an attempt now to weaken the patent laws inside the United States. Devising alternative energy sources inside this country is going to stimulate a burst of technology that will make the computer age, will be an equivalent, Silicon Valley. We need strong patent protections so that people will invest in the new technologies. We do need the tax credits given to these energy sources,
Which are about to expire in September.
which are about to expire in September. We need those credits so that at this initial stage, they can get started and then work their way down the cost curves. And then we need to find ways to conserve energy and make better use. Bob Herbert did a wonderful op-ed piece about 3 weeks ago where he says we're really missing the potentials on conservation. I'm involved with a little company that makes additives to gasoline and diesel, and they can get 6 to 8% increase in the efficiency of these engines, 1 gallon for every 2,000 gallons of diesel. Now, this is not glamorous stuff that I'm talking about here, but there's a whole series of little individual steps that we can do.
I want to give you the last question. I saw the frown, and we don't want anybody to leave unhappy.
Particularly a
And I want,
journalist.
yeah, you got to go get a book, and we'll have Pat sign it. And the pressure's on you.
Yeah. Can I have a time to talk with you?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Two questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
As long as they're both 30 seconds each.
Yeah. One question is, I want to make sure the dark effects of the middle class from the maniac globalization. You said some sort of unsafe of import goods and job loss is some sort of the dark effect.
Yeah.
I think so. But I'm from Japan, and I want to know the logic of the dark effects of the globalization to the working class or middle class of whole country.
Okay.
And
Of which country? Of
whole other countries.
other countries
Other
as well.
countries,
Okay.
right, yeah.
Terrific. And part two?
And part two. You mentioned about WTO or international arguments, and I want to ask, do you think some international policy cooperation, such as currency cooperation, or in these 10 years, United States asked Japan to make a structural reform of the economic systems, and such international political cooperation is need or not? Do you think which is a better way to make a globalization world with developed countries, emerging markets, and less developed countries?
And to piggyback on that, I don't want to go on too long, but it's very interesting because I did a lot of media yesterday on Japan's new economic numbers out, tilting towards what looks like a recession, and how hard it is for a major global stakeholder like Japan to do anything along those lines when it's got such a tight situation of its own.
Sorry, so long question.
No, good question.
Good questions. You get more time for good questions.
As to the question of the harmful effects of globalization, in large part, that is a function of how we set the rules of globalization. But even more so, it's how each country adapts itself to globalization. The United States has chosen to throw its borders open to imports and to lower its standards and to not do the safety inspections. Your country, on the other hand, has very tight standards. In the question of the import of foods, let's take chicken, which is can be a dangerous import. Japan has designated 36 companies that produce chicken for export into Japan. The Japanese inspect 15% of all of those chicken imports that come into Japan. At the same time, Japan assigns inspectors in those 36 plants, and then it sends in tiger teams to do intense analysis of the safety of those facilities. That is a difference in how you deal with it. And that I would adopt and suggest to the U.S. to adopt the Japanese model. As to the broader questions, the WTO has a potentially very useful role. When one takes a look at these transnational corporations and the operations, and at one point I worked for the International Division of the Internal Revenue Service tracking down tax cheats. And one of the things that you find is that you have countries around the world that are cheated out of the monies that they're owed and are due. And you find all kinds of games with transfer pricing. It would be very useful to use the WTO perhaps as a means to deal with taxes that are involved in global trade and to make sure that there is a fair and honest distribution. One of the things I get into this book is the concentration of industries. Inside the United States, in the cattle producing industry, we had something like 36 major packing plants in 1980. We today have 4. We're down to 4 firms control 85% of the industry. It's more concentrated when Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were breaking up the meat trust. This is happening across the board, but it's happening on a global scale. We need a global response on this. No single nation can enforce competitive policies. Perhaps the WTO is the means to do that. We need the WTO to be something other than a tool of transnational corporations so they can exploit labor, get weak environmental activities. The structure can be changed. What it requires is leadership. And I think if we have a strong president, we can have that kind of leadership.
You know, just in closing, you know, whenever I get together with Pat Choate, whether one agrees with the sort of broad message or not, you come out with ideas like individual training accounts or ways in which to look at antitrust in the energy area, something I have to say I hadn't really thought about. I've been thinking a lot about the R&D tax credit on renewables, which is about to expire, which makes no sense to me, and a lot of other issues. And when you're in the sort of think tank sector and you kind of get in your groove and you've got your constituents and you're out there, it's very hard sometimes to provoke one's thinking in a constructive way so that you can continue to matter in these debates. I have not yet fully read Dangerous Business. I have run through it quickly, but it is already filled with a lot of great ideas that the United States should be thinking about as it thinks about national economic strategies and where we are today. So I want to thank Pat Choate. Please help me give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring him right out front because we've arranged for folks who want to have a book to get them, so rush him out there, not up here. But let me bring you out here real quick.